Picture this: an empire at the height of its power, its armies unstoppable, its cities thriving. Then, almost overnight, everything collapses, not because of war or invasion, but because the rains stopped falling. This isn't fiction, it's history, written not just by kings and conquerors, but by something far more powerful: the climate. For thousands of years, shifts in weather patterns, volcanic eruptions, and prolonged droughts have quietly shaped the rise and fall of civilizations, redirecting the course of human history in ways we're only beginning to understand. From the downfall of mighty empires to the birth of revolutions, climate has been the invisible hand guiding humanity's fate, often with devastating consequences and surprising opportunities. Think about the last time extreme weather disrupted your life. Maybe a storm knocked out power for days, or a heat wave made it unbearable to go outside. Now imagine that disruption lasting not days, but decades. That's what happened during the Little Ice Age, when plunging temperatures turned fertile fields into frozen wastelands, sparking famines and wars that reshaped Europe. Or consider the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when relentless drought forced millions of Americans to abandon their homes, creating one of the largest migrations in U.S. history. These weren't just bad weather events, they were turning points that altered economies, toppled governments, and even inspired iconic works of literature like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, born from the gloom of a volcanic winter. What if I told you that some of history's greatest mysteries, the sudden collapse of the Maya, the disappearance of the Anasazi, even the chaos that fueled the French Revolution, can be traced back to climate? These events weren't random. They were the result of nature's unpredictable power, a force that has humbled kings, toppled dynasties, and rewritten the destiny of entire civilizations. In this video, we'll unravel 29 of these pivotal moments, each a stark reminder of how fragile human societies are when faced with the planet's fury. But more than that, we'll discover what these events can teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the precarious balance between humanity and the natural world. Because if history has shown us one thing, it's that climate doesn't just shape the past, it's already shaping our future. Imagine waking up one morning to find your entire world had changed overnight, not because of war or politics, but because the very air had grown colder. This wasn't just a bad winter. It was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift so profound it reshaped Europe for centuries. Starting in the 14th century, temperatures plummeted, growing seasons shortened, and crops that had once flourished now withered in the fields. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Between 1315 and 1317, the Great Famine struck, a catastrophe so severe that chroniclers of the time described people eating bark, roots, and even their own livestock out of desperation. Entire villages vanished, their populations starved or scattered in search of food. But the cold didn't stop there. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe's rivers, normally bustling trade routes, froze solid. Paintings from the era capture surreal scenes of markets set up on the ice, with merchants huddled in furs, their breath visible in the frigid air. The Thames in London froze so completely that frost fairs became a regular spectacle, complete with temporary shops and even ice skating. Yet beneath the surface of these curious snapshots lay a darker reality. The relentless cold disrupted food supplies, spiking grain prices, and pushing already struggling populations to the brink. When harvests failed year after year, social tensions boiled over. The 30 Years' War, one of the deadliest conflicts in European history, wasn't just about religion or territory. It was also a war fueled by hunger, as desperate armies ravaged the countryside for scraps of food. What made the Little Ice Age so transformative wasn't just the weather itself, but how it exposed the fragility of human systems. Governments that couldn't feed their people lost legitimacy. Trade networks buckled under the strain of failed harvests. Even art and culture shifted, with painters like Bruegel the Elder capturing the harsh beauty of snow-laden landscapes, a stark departure from the sun-drenched scenes of earlier eras. This wasn't just a change in climate, it was a reckoning, a reminder that even the mightiest societies are at the mercy of the natural world. And as we'll see time and again in history, when the climate shifts, humanity has no choice but to adapt or collapse. The sky turned black at noon, not from storm clouds, but from towering walls of dirt that swallowed entire farms in minutes. This was the Dust Bowl, the catastrophic convergence of nature's wrath and human miscalculation that transformed America's breadbasket into a barren hellscape during the 1930s. For nearly a decade, relentless drought baked the Great Plains, while decades of deep plowing had stripped away the prairie grasses whose roots once held the soil in place. Without that natural anchor, the wind did the rest, lifting millions of tons of topsoil into apocalyptic dust storms that blotted out the sun. Families woke to find drifts of dirt piled against their doors like snow, their fields reduced to cracked earth and their futures erased with every gust. The human toll was staggering. Over 2.5 million people, many of them tenant farmers who'd already lost everything, packed their few belongings into jalopies and joined a desperate exodus westward. Route 66 became a river of broken dreams, lined with roadside graves and makeshift camps where children begged for food. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured the hollow-eyed faces of the displaced, images that seared the crisis into America's conscience. One of her most haunting subjects, Florence Owens Thompson, became the iconic migrant mother, her weathered hands cradling a baby as two more children hid their faces against her shoulders. This wasn't just poverty, it was the unraveling of an entire way of life. Yet from this tragedy emerged something unexpected, a blueprint for survival. The federal government's response, spearheaded by Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, revolutionized how America interacted with its land. The newly created Soil Conservation Service taught farmers techniques like crop rotation and contour plowing, methods that mimicked nature's own defenses against erosion. Shelter belts, rows of trees planted to break the wind, stitched the landscape back together, while the Taylor Grazing Act finally regulated the overuse of public lands that had exacerbated the disaster. These weren't just policy changes, they were a cultural reckoning, a recognition that the land wasn't an inexhaustible resource to be conquered, but a fragile partner to be nurtured. The Dust Bowl's legacy lingers not just in the soil, but in the stories of those who endured it. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath immortalized the Joad family's harrowing journey to California, where promises of work often dissolved into exploitation. Woody Guthrie's folk songs gave voice to the anger and hope of a generation that had lost everything but their dignity. And in places like Cimarron County, Oklahoma, where some towns lost 90% of their population, the land still bears scars visible from space. This wasn't merely a historical event, it was a warning etched into the earth itself, reminding us that progress without stewardship is a recipe for ruin. When the winds howl across the plains today, they carry more than dust, they carry the echoes of a lesson hard learned. 1816 should have been a year like any other, but instead it became known as the year without a summer, a chilling anomaly that left the world shivering in confusion. The culprit, a volcano half a world away, Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, had erupted the previous year with such force that it ejected an unimaginable volume of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The particles spread like a veil across the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space and plunging temperatures into freefall. By June, snow blanketed New England, ice thickened in Pennsylvania rivers during July, and crops across Europe and North America withered in fields that should have been lush with harvest. The consequences were as immediate as they were devastating. In Switzerland, where the poet Lord Byron rented a villa by Lake Geneva, the unseasonable cold forced him and his guests, including a young Mary Shelley, to abandon their outdoor pursuits and huddle indoors. To pass the time, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. What emerged from that gloomy retreat was Shelley's Frankenstein, a tale of creation and catastrophe that mirrored the unnatural winter outside. Meanwhile, far from literary circles, ordinary people faced horrors no fiction could match. Grain prices skyrocketed as harvests failed, leading to food riots from France to China. In Ireland, desperate families ate nettles and rotten potatoes, while in India, delayed monsoons triggered cholera outbreaks that killed millions. Even livestock perished, their frozen bodies dotting pastures like morbid sculptures. But the impact of Tambora's eruption went beyond hunger and art. It reshaped economies and migrations. New England farmers, ruined by frosts in August, abandoned their homesteads for the Midwest, accelerating America's westward expansion. In Europe, the crisis exposed the fragility of food systems, spurring innovations like canned food and faster grain transport. And in the Alps, glaciers advanced so relentlessly that Swiss villagers awoke to find ice swallowing their homes. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a preview of how interconnected and vulnerable the modern world had become. The year without a summer stands as a testament to nature's power to rewrite human plans in a single season. It reminds us that beneath the surface of history's grand narratives, wars, inventions, empires lies the quiet, inescapable influence of climate. When Tambora spoke, the world listened. And in that listening, we find a lesson for our own era. No society, no matter how advanced, is immune to the whims of the planet we call home. 4,000 years ago, the Akkadian Empire stood as a marvel of human achievement, the world's first true empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Its rulers, like the legendary Sargon of Akkad, commanded vast armies and built monumental cities that buzzed with trade and innovation. Then, almost inexplicably, it all crumbled. Not by invasion or revolt, but by something far more insidious, the sky's refusal to rain. Around 2200 BCE, a mega-drought descended on Mesopotamia, a dry spell so severe it lasted not years but centuries. The once fertile crescent, nourished by the Tigris and Euphrates, became a cracked wasteland. Archaeological digs tell the grim story, layers of sediment suddenly barren, entire cities abandoned mid-meal, their pots still filled with uneaten grain. The scale of the disaster becomes clear in the ruins of Tel Leilan, a bustling Akkadian city in modern-day Syria. Excavations reveal a sudden, dramatic shift. Streets lined with collapsed buildings, their mud-brick walls eroded by wind rather than war. Soil samples tell an even starker tale. Layers of dust and mineral deposits show rainfall dropped by nearly 30%, turning farmland into desert. With no crops to harvest, the empire's intricate trade networks, the lifeblood of its economy, collapsed like a house of cards. Tablets from the period hint at the desperation, with scribes pleading to distant outposts for food. Our city is starving. Send grain or we perish, but no relief came. What makes the Akkadian collapse so haunting isn't just its scale, but its echoes in our own time. The empire's fall wasn't just about drought, it was about rigidity. The Akkadians had mastered irrigation, but their systems relied on predictable rivers. When the rains failed upstream, their canals ran dry. They'd centralized power but couldn't adapt when crisis struck. Sound familiar? Today, we face our own climate reckoning: rising seas, shifting weather patterns, dwindling resources. The Akkadians' fate is a cautionary tale carved in clay. Civilizations that mistake temporary stability for permanence are playing a dangerous game. Yet amidst the ruins, there's a glimmer of hope. Some Akkadian settlements didn't vanish, they transformed. In the north, smaller communities adapted by shifting to drought-resistant crops like barley and relying on nomadic herding. Their survival hints at a truth we're still grappling with. Resilience isn't about strength alone, but flexibility. The empire's heart may have turned to dust, but its lessons linger in the wind, whispering that even the greatest societies are only as durable as their ability to change with the world around them. The Mediterranean world of the 12th century BC was a tapestry of thriving empires: the Hittites with their iron-forged armies, the Mycenaeans with their gold-laced palaces, the Egyptians with their unshakable dynasties. Then, in what seems like the blink of an eye, it all unraveled. Cities burned, trade routes fell silent, and entire writing systems vanished into oblivion. Historians once blamed this collapse solely on mysterious sea peoples invading from the unknown. But modern science reveals a far more complex villain: a climate crisis that turned the Bronze Age world upside down. Tree rings and sediment cores tell the startling truth. Around 1200 BC, a 300-year drought gripped the eastern Mediterranean like a vise. Lakes shrank, rivers ran dry, and crops failed from Anatolia to the Nile Delta. At the same time, geological evidence suggests a spike in earthquakes, perhaps even a volcanic eruption, shattering cities already teetering on the edge. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a marvel of fortifications, was abandoned so hastily that clay tablets in royal archives still sat oven-fired, preserving desperate pleas for grain shipments that never came. Meanwhile, Mycenaean Greece, the land of Agamemnon and the Trojan War legends, saw its palace economies collapse as famine bred rebellion. Linear B, their intricate script, disappeared for centuries, plunging the region into a dark age where even the memory of writing was lost. Yet this wasn't just destruction, it was transformation. In the power vacuum left by fallen empires, new players emerged. The Phoenicians, spared the worst of the drought, turned their coastal cities into maritime powerhouses, inventing the alphabet we still use today. Inland, scattered tribes coalesced into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, their stories later woven into the Hebrew Bible. Even Egypt, though battered, adapted by shifting its focus southward to Nubia's gold mines. The crisis had rewritten the rules, proving that civilizations don't merely end, they evolve under pressure. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so gripping isn't just its scale, but its eerie familiarity. Like our own interconnected world, these empires were bound by trade and mutual dependence. When climate disruption severed those ties, the system imploded. The Hittites relied on Egyptian grain. Mycenaean merchants needed Cypriot copper. Sound familiar? Today's supply chains are just as vulnerable to nature's whims. The lesson here isn't doom, it's adaptability. The societies that survived weren't the strongest, but the most nimble, willing to abandon old ways for new survival strategies. When the rain stopped and the earth shook, history didn't end. It pivoted. For 3 centuries, Europe basked in a climatic sweet spot that historians now call the medieval warm period, a time when nature itself seemed to smile upon human ambition. Between 900 and 1300 CE, temperatures rose just enough to extend growing seasons, fatten harvests, and set the stage for a cultural explosion. Vineyards crept north into England, their grapes producing wines that rivaled France's. Wheat fields stretched farther than ever before, filling granaries to bursting. This wasn't just good weather, it was the foundation of a golden age. Nowhere was this more visible than in the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals. With full bellies and thriving economies, communities poured their wealth into stone and stained glass. Chartres, Notre Dame, and Canterbury rose skyward, their construction funded by tithes from bountiful harvests. The same warmth that ripened crops also dried clay for bricks and made transporting heavy timber feasible, small climatic gifts that enabled grand human visions. Even the Vikings, those notorious raiders, turned their attention to greener pastures literally. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, sailed west and stumbled upon a land so lush he dubbed it Greenland in a stroke of marketing genius. For a few generations, Norse settlements thrived there, their pastures supporting cattle and their churches standing testament to a fleeting frontier dream. But the medieval warm period's greatest legacy might be its cautionary end. By the early 14th century, the climate pendulum swung back. Temperatures dropped, glaciers advanced, and those once fertile Viking farms in Greenland became ice-locked tombs. The same North Atlantic currents that had carried settlers west now brought crushing storms and longer winters. In Europe, the good times faded as crops failed with increasing frequency, setting the stage for the famines and plagues that would define the next century. What makes this era so poignant is its reminder that prosperity is often borrowed, not earned. The cathedrals still stand, but the climate that built them has long since shifted. The Vikings' Greenland colonies swallowed by ice, leaving only ruins and a haunting question. When the weather changes, will we recognize the warning signs in time? The medieval warm period wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a masterclass in how civilizations rise on the back of favorable conditions, only to face reckoning when those conditions vanish. Today, as we chart our own course through a warming world, its lessons whisper across the centuries: adapt or perish. The Nile wasn't just a river to the ancient Egyptians, it was the heartbeat of their civilization, a divine rhythm that dictated life and death. Every summer, its floods deposited rich black silt across the valley, transforming barren land into the most productive farmland in the ancient world. The entire economy, from the pharaoh's granaries to the humblest farmer's plot, depended on this annual miracle. But around 2200 BCE, that rhythm stuttered. The floods grew weak, some years failing entirely. The result, a collapse so severe that historians call it the First Intermediate Period, a chaotic era when Egypt fractured into warring factions and the pyramids stood silent, their priests unable to feed even themselves. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of this unraveling. Tomb inscriptions from the period shift from boasting of abundance to pleading with the gods for mercy. The land is in chaos, laments one official's inscription. Men starve, children weep, and the desert creeps closer. At the sacred site of Abydos, where generations of kings had been buried, graves from this era show skeletons stunted by malnutrition, their bones whispering of famine's toll. Even more telling are the layers of sediment along the Nile's banks. Where thick deposits of fertile silt should mark each year's flood, there are instead thin, parched streaks like scars across the landscape. But the crisis wasn't just environmental, it was existential. Egyptian cosmology held that the pharaoh was the guarantor of Mat, the divine order that kept chaos at bay. When the Nile failed, it wasn't just a drought, it was a crack in the universe. Local governors, no longer trusting the central authority to feed them, seized power in their regions. Tomb robbers plundered royal graves, desperate for the gold and food buried with the dead. the pyramid texts once reserved for kings began appearing in the tombs of commoners, as if the very hierarchy of the afterlife had collapsed along with the state. Yet this wasn't the end of Egypt's story. By 2500 BC, the floods returned, and a new dynasty reunified the kingdom, ushering in the Middle Kingdom's renaissance. But the trauma of the collapse lingered. Later pharaohs, perhaps remembering the famine, built massive granaries and irrigation projects to hedge against future droughts. The lesson had been seared into their collective memory. Even the mightiest civilization is just one failed flood away from ruin. Fast forward 1,000 years, and history repeated itself. Around 1200 BC, the Nile's floods weakened again, coinciding with the broader Bronze Age collapse that toppled empires across the Mediterranean. This time, the crisis was compounded by external pressures. Libyan raids, Sea People's invasions, but at its core, the problem was the same: a river that no longer sustained its people. The New Kingdom, Egypt's golden age of empire and temple building, withered like a neglected crop. By the time the dust settled, the age of the pharaohs as divine rulers was effectively over, replaced by a patchwork of weaker dynasties and foreign overlords. What makes the Nile's failures so haunting is their inevitability. Modern climatologists now know that both collapses align with global megadroughts likely triggered by shifts in monsoon patterns or volcanic eruptions. The Egyptians, for all their sophistication, had no way to predict or prevent these changes. Their entire society was a bet on the Nile's consistency, a bet that held for millennia until suddenly, catastrophically, it didn't. Today, as we face our own climate uncertainties, their story echoes with eerie relevance. Civilizations built on fragile ecological foundations may thrive for ages, but when the foundation crumbles, even the grandest monuments can't save them. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the Maya built a civilization so advanced it mapped the stars with precision, devised a calendar more accurate than Europe's, and erected pyramids that still stagger modern engineers. Yet by the time the first Spanish ships appeared off the Yucatan coast, these great cities Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul stood empty, their grandeur swallowed by vines and silence. What happened? The answer lies not in invasion or plague, but in something far more ordinary yet equally lethal: a lack of rain. Between 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya heartland suffered a series of droughts so severe they upended a society built on abundance. Tree rings from the region tell the story in stark detail, year after year of shrunken growth, signaling rainfall deficits that would have turned reservoirs to mud and cornfields to dust. At its peak, Tikal alone supported up to 100,000 people, a population density rivaling modern Los Angeles. But with no rivers or natural lakes, every drop of water depended on seasonal rains filling massive man-made reservoirs. When those rains failed, the system collapsed like a house of cards. Archaeologists find chilling evidence in the ruins: hastily dug wells in palace courtyards, ceremonial cenotes drained to their cracked beds, even the bones of children showing signs of acute malnutrition. Yet the drought alone doesn't explain the scale of the disaster. The Maya had weathered dry spells before. This time, they faced a crisis of their own making. Centuries of unchecked growth had stripped the landscape bare, forests cleared for farmland, hillsides terraced until the soil eroded, entire ecosystems simplified to feed an insatiable urban machine. Pollen samples reveal the tragic sequence. As cities grew, diverse rainforest species vanished, replaced by monocultures of maize. Without tree roots to hold it, topsoil washed away during rare downpours, leaving behind barren limestone. The Maya weren't just victims of climate, they'd unwittingly amplified its effects, turning a challenge into a catastrophe. What makes their collapse so haunting isn't just the hubris, but the ingenuity they marshaled against it. In the Patain region, engineers built intricate canal systems to redirect every precious drop of runoff. At Krakatoa, vast terraces slowed erosion while feeding thousands. For a while, these innovations worked until they didn't. The lesson here isn't that the Maya failed, but that adaptation has limits. When the drought stretched beyond living memory, when the reservoirs stayed empty for generations, even the most brilliant solutions crumbled. The final act played out in eerie silence. At Kapon, scribes chiseled their last dated monument in 822 CE, mid-sentence, as if the stonemason had simply walked away. In the palaces of Tikal, nobles burned their own thrones in desperate rituals, begging gods who no longer answered. By the time the rains returned, it was too late. The population had scattered, its survivors retreating to smaller villages or melting into the jungle. The great cities became ghostly reminders of a stark truth. Civilizations, like ecosystems, can reach a tipping point where no amount of wisdom can undo what's been broken. Today, as we confront our own climate uncertainties, the Maya story resonates with uncomfortable clarity. They weren't primitive or ignorant, they were a mirror. Their mastery of astronomy couldn't predict the droughts, just as our satellites can't fully foresee the consequences of deforestation. Their reservoirs were no match for prolonged aridity, just as our dams may falter in the face of rising temperatures. But there's hope in their legacy too, in the way some communities adapted, shifting to smaller-scale farming or migrating to wetter regions. The Maya didn't vanish, they transformed. And in that transformation lies a warning and perhaps a roadmap. Survive not by conquering nature, but by learning to move with its rhythms. Europe in the mid-14th century was a continent on the edge not of war or revolution, but of a biological storm that would rewrite its destiny. The Black Death didn't arrive in a vacuum. Its devastation was magnified by a climate that had turned treacherous. The years leading up to 1347 had been marked by the Little Ice Age's unrelenting grip, colder winters, wetter springs, and summers that swung between floods and droughts. These weren't just bad seasons, they were the perfect incubator for catastrophe. Rodents, particularly the black rats that thrived in Europe's crowded cities, found these conditions ideal. Cooler temperatures slowed their metabolism, allowing fleas to feast longer on their blood, and with each bite, the fleas ingested the deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria. When those fleas jumped to humans, the results were apocalyptic, but the climate's role went deeper than just rat populations. Failed harvests from erratic weather had already weakened immune systems. Malnourished bodies were easy targets for a pathogen that attacked the lymph nodes, turning them into grotesque buboes that oozed pus and blood. Contemporary accounts describe towns where the living couldn't bury the dead fast enough, where the stench of rotting flesh hung in the air like a shroud. The pandemic's path was no accident. Tree ring data reveals that the plague's deadliest waves coincided with periods of extreme weather volatility. In England, the winter of 1348 was so harsh that the Thames froze solid, trapping ships in ice, a spectacle that became a macabre backdrop to mass graves. Meanwhile, in Italy, chroniclers noted that unseasonable rains turned streets into muddy rivers, perfect for spreading contaminated waste. The disease didn't discriminate between rich and poor, but it did follow the roads carved by climate. Regions already struggling with famine like Flanders, where grain yields had plummeted, suffered disproportionately. What makes the Black Death's climate link so chilling isn't just the body count, but the way it exposes humanity's precarious place in the natural order. Medieval medicine, for all its herbal remedies and bleeding practices, was powerless against a menace amplified by shifting weather patterns. The plague's survivors, inheriting a half-empty world, would rebuild with radical shifts, abandoning feudal systems, demanding higher wages, even questioning the church's authority. Climate had nudged biology, biology had reshaped society, and in that chain reaction lay a timeless truth. When the environment changes, it doesn't just alter landscapes, it rewires the very fabric of human life. Yet amid the horror, there's an unsettling parallel to our own era. Today, as warming climates expand the range of disease-carrying mosquitoes and ticks, we're reminded that the dance between climate and pathogens never really ended. The Black Death wasn't an anomaly, it was a warning etched in the bones of millions. And as we confront our own ecological imbalances, its lesson echoes across the centuries. Civilization's greatest threats often come not from armies or ideologies, but from the unseen consequences of a changing world. Rome's legions marched on full stomachs, a fact as crucial to their conquests as their famed discipline. Between 200 BCE and 150 CE, the Mediterranean world basked in what scientists now call the Roman climate optimum, a period of unusually warm and stable weather that turned the empire's breadbaskets into engines of expansion. Vineyards crept north into Britain, olive groves flourished in Gaul, and Egyptian wheat fields yielded bumper harvests that fed 1 million souls in Rome itself. This wasn't just good fortune, it was the invisible foundation of an empire. The data behind this golden age is etched into tree trunks and lake beds. Alpine larch trees from this era show wide, even growth rings, proof of consistent growing seasons. Sediment cores from Libyan lakes reveal layers rich in pollen from olive and grapevines, crops that need precisely the warm, dry conditions the Optimum provided. Even Roman writers like Pliny the Elder marveled at how far north certain fruits could now grow, calling it a gift of Ceres, but the real beneficiaries were Rome's armies. A single legion required over 2 tons of grain per day, an impossible burden without reliable harvests. The climate didn't just feed soldiers, it fueled the roads, ships, and bureaucracy that stitched the empire together. Then, around 150 CE, the weather turned. Ice cores from Greenland tell the story, a sudden spike in sulfate particles, likely from distant volcanic eruptions, followed by centuries of cooling. In Rome's frontier provinces, the change was subtle at first, a bad harvest here, a delayed shipment there, but by the 3rd century, the cracks became chasms. North African grain yields, once the empire's lifeline, dropped by nearly 40%. Along the Rhine and Danube, shorter growing seasons meant Germanic tribes had less to lose by raiding Roman territory. The empire's response, higher taxes, heavier conscription, only bred resentment among populations already straining under hunger. What makes Rome's climate story so compelling isn't just the decline, but the stark contrast with its rise. The same Mediterranean that had been a highway for trade became a bottleneck when storms grew fiercer and pirate havens multiplied in deserted coastal towns. The Annona system, Rome's ingenious grain dole that had kept the masses content, became a liability when shipments faltered. Even the famed Roman roads, engineered to last centuries, couldn't outpace the erosion caused by increasingly erratic rains. Yet to blame climate alone would be to miss the fuller picture. The empire's rigid social hierarchy left it ill-prepared to adapt. Wealthy landowners shifted from wheat to more drought-resistant but less nutritious crops like barley, leaving the poor to subsist on ever coarser bread. Corruption siphoned off grain reserves meant for lean years, and when Emperor Aurelian tried to stabilize prices with currency reforms, he inadvertently triggered hyperinflation, a crisis made worse by empty granaries. The climate didn't kill Rome, but it exposed every weakness in its glittering facade. Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in Rome's periphery. In Britain, where the Optimum had once allowed villas to flourish with underfloor heating and imported luxuries, 4th century skeletons show signs of rickets and scurvy, diseases of malnutrition. At Vindolanda, a fort near Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists found tablets pleading for reinforcements not against barbarians, but against starvation. The frontier hadn't moved, the weather had, and with it, the empire's ability to project power. Rome's legacy, then, isn't just aqueducts and laws, but a cautionary tale about the limits of imperial resilience. The climate optimum had allowed the empire to overextend, to build cities in marginal lands and assume the weather would always cooperate. When it didn't, the contraction was brutal. Yet even in its twilight, Rome adapted where it could, switching to feudal-style local farming when long-distance trade failed, embracing new religions that offered hope in uncertain times. The lesson isn't that civilizations must fall to climate shifts, but that survival depends on recognizing when the old rules no longer apply. As we face our own era of climate volatility, Rome whispers across the centuries, prosperity built on stable weather is prosperity built on sand. High atop the mesas of the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, built a civilization that seemed to defy the harsh desert. Their cliff dwellings at places like Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon were marvels of engineering, wedged into sandstone alcoves with intricate masonry and gravity-defying ladders. They developed elaborate systems to trap every precious drop of rain, from terraced fields that slowed erosion to cisterns carved into bedrock. But around 1300 CE, something went terribly wrong. The people who had thrived for centuries suddenly abandoned their homes, leaving behind pottery, tools, even the remains of meals. The reason? A drought so severe it turned their world to dust. Tree rings from the region tell a story of growing desperation. Starting in 1276, a 23-year dry spell gripped the Colorado Plateau, the longest in over 1,000 years. Springs dried up, crops withered, and the once reliable monsoon rains failed season after season. At Choco Canyon, archaeologists find eerie evidence of the crisis. Corn cobs smaller than a thumb, their stunted growth a silent testament to starvation. The Anasazi had faced droughts before, but this was different. Their carefully engineered water systems, designed for sporadic dry spells, were no match for a generation-long catastrophe. Reservoirs that had nourished thousands became cracked pits of sun-baked clay. What makes their disappearance so haunting isn't just the scale of the drought, but the choices it forced. At some settlements, like those in the Kayenta region, people tried to adapt by building even more complex irrigation networks. Elsewhere, they turned to violence. Skeletons from the period show signs of blunt force trauma and cannibalism, suggesting societal collapse under the strain. But most chilling are the sites where departure seemed almost ritualistic. At Sand Canyon Pueblo, doors were deliberately sealed with masonry, as if the inhabitants hoped to return one day. They never did, yet the Anasazi didn't vanish entirely. They migrated, some joining the Hopi to the west, others settling along the Rio Grande, where their descendants became the Pueblo peoples. Their story isn't one of extinction, but of transformation under pressure. The cliff dwellings stand empty not because they failed, but because survival sometimes means walking away from the impossible. Today, as the Southwest faces its own drought, the worst in 1,200 years, their legacy looms large. Modern cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas rely on water systems just as precarious as Chaco's. The Anasazi's lesson is clear. Ingenuity can delay disaster, but only humility can avert it. When the rain stops, even the grandest architectures of civilization are just sandcastles waiting for the tide. In the year 535, the sun dimmed as if a great lamp had been smothered. Across the globe, from Constantinople to Chang'an, people looked up in terror as the sky turned a sickly yellow, then grey, and finally a twilight murk that lasted not hours but 18 agonizing months. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave forth its light without brightness like the moon, while Irish chronicles described a failure of bread so severe that people resorted to eating nettles and tree bark. This wasn't just a bad year, it was an ecological shockwave that historians now call the worst year in human history to be alive. The culprit, scientists still debate whether it was a volcanic eruption, perhaps Indonesia's Krakatoa, or a comet striking Earth's atmosphere, but the evidence is written in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. Layers of sulfate deposits from 536C are thicker than those from any other event in the past 2,000 years, signaling an atmospheric cataclysm that ejected enough ash and dust to block sunlight worldwide. Tree rings from Mongolia to California tell the same grim story: stunted growth, as if the very breath of the planet had been stifled. Summer temperatures in Europe and Asia plunged by up to 4 degrees Celsius, enough to trigger frosts in August and snow in June. Crops rotted in the fields, and those that somehow grew were withered and meager. The human toll was staggering. In China's Henan province, records from the northern Wei Dynasty describe a summer so cold that frost killed 90% of the wheat harvest, sparking famines that forced survivors into cannibalism. In Scandinavia, where growing seasons were already perilously short, entire villages vanished from the archaeological record. Even the mighty Byzantine Empire, then at its height under Emperor Justinian, reeled as grain shipments from Egypt faltered. The capital's bread dole, a cornerstone of political stability, was cut, fueling unrest that would later explode into the Nika riots. And then, as if nature hadn't done enough, bubonic plague arrived in 541, spreading like wildfire through populations weakened by hunger. The Justinian plague would eventually claim half of Constantinople's inhabitants, a tragedy made possible by the climate chaos of 536. Yet the most haunting legacy of this crisis might be its echoes in art and myth. Some scholars link the Arthurian legend of the wasteland, a kingdom cursed with barrenness, to folk memories of this period. In Mesoamerica, the Teotihuacan civilization collapsed around this time, its pyramids abandoned amid signs of drought and social upheaval. Even the Norse myth of Fimbulwinter, a great cold preceding Ragnarök, may trace its roots to ancestral memories of a time when the sun itself seemed broken. What makes 536 so terrifying isn't just the scale of suffering, but how abruptly it arrived. Unlike the slow creep of the Little Ice Age or the gradual droughts that felled the Maya, this was a catastrophe measured in weeks. One year, the world was normal. The next, it was a place of perpetual dusk and failing harvests. The lesson for our own era of climate uncertainty is stark. Civilization's balance is more fragile than we dare admit. When the sky itself turns against us, no army, no treasury, no technology can shield us from the consequences. The people of 536 had no warning, no time to prepare. Their only legacy is a whisper across the centuries, a reminder that sometimes history doesn't turn slowly. Sometimes it shatters in a single, sunless year. At the height of its power, the Tang Dynasty was a radiant beacon of civilization, its poets crafting verses still memorized by schoolchildren today, its silk-laden caravans stretching all the way to Baghdad, its capital Chang'an a bustling metropolis of 2 million souls. Yet this golden age rested on a fragile foundation, the predictable rhythm of the summer monsoons that watered the fertile plains of northern China. When those rains faltered in the 9th century, the empire's glittering facade cracked under the weight of hunger and discontent. The first warnings came from the rice fields. Farmers along the Yellow River noticed the monsoon clouds arriving later each year, their downpours lighter and more erratic. Soon, official reports to Emperor Xianzong told a grim tale. Reservoirs drying up, irrigation canals reduced to muddy trickles, wheat stalks stunted before they could form grain. The government's meticulous grain storage system, a network of granaries designed to weather lean years, began emptying at alarming rates. By 830 CE, drought gripped 7 provinces simultaneously, a disaster scale the bureaucracy couldn't manage. Court poets who once wrote about blooming peonies now composed verses about children's swollen bellies and villages reduced to eating bark. What made this drought so catastrophic wasn't just the failed harvests, but the Tang's inability to adapt its rigid systems. The dynasty had perfected an elaborate tax system based on grain quotas from specific regions. When those regions turned to dust, the state demanded the same impossible tribute. Peasants who couldn't pay fled their land, becoming roving bands of desperate migrants. Banditry exploded along the Grand Canal, where grain barges became targets for starving mobs. Even the mighty imperial army stationed along the frontiers to guard against Tibetan and Uyghur incursions began disintegrating as soldiers deserted to find food. The rebellion that finally broke the dynasty's back began with a salt smuggler named Huang Kao. In 875, his ragtag army of dispossessed farmers and unemployed laborers snowballed into an unstoppable force, fueled by rage against a government that kept collecting taxes while children starved. Huang's troops sacked Guangzhou, slaughtering thousands of Persian and Arab traders, then turned north toward Luoyang and Chang'an. By the time they took the capital in 881, the streets ran red with the blood of imperial officials and aristocratic families. The Tang emperor fled like a common refugee, his palace reduced to smoldering ruins. Climate scientists studying stalagmites in Chinese caves now understand what went wrong. Layers of oxygen isotopes reveal that the 9th century saw the weakest East Asian monsoon patterns in over 700 years, likely triggered by a combination of volcanic activity and shifts in Pacific Ocean temperatures. The Tang's collapse wasn't just bad luck, it was the culmination of decades when the skies withheld their life-giving rains. Yet amid the chaos, the monsoon failure birthed unexpected innovations. In southern China, where rainfall remained more reliable, farmers developed new drought-resistant rice varieties from Vietnamese strains. The shattered tax system gave way to a more flexible monetary economy, reducing dependence on vulnerable grain shipments. And the rebellion's violence forced a decentralization of power that would shape China's next golden age under the Song dynasty. The Tang story resonates today as a cautionary tale about centralized systems in a changing climate. Their granaries were the ancient equivalent of modern supply chains, efficient until the unexpected strikes. Their tax policies mirrored contemporary economic structures that punish regions suffering ecological collapse. When the monsoons failed, the empire didn't just starve. It discovered how quickly prosperity built on predictability can unravel. As we face our own era of climate volatility, the Tang dynasty whispers across 12 centuries. Civilizations thrive not when they resist change, but when they learn to bend with it. The 17th century dawned with a whisper of frost, a creeping cold that would reshape the world. From the battlefields of Europe to the rice terraces of China, temperatures plummeted in what scientists now call the Little Ice Age's cruelest chapter. Glaciers advanced, swallowing alpine villages. Rivers that had never frozen before became ice roads. But the real devastation happened in the fields, where crops failed year after year, turning breadbaskets into wastelands and sparking a chain reaction of famine, rebellion, and war that stretched across continents. Nowhere was this more brutal than in Central Europe. where the 30 Years' War raged from 1618 to 1648. What began as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics soon spiraled into a free-for-all of starvation and slaughter. Armies, unable to feed themselves off the land, pillaged villages with savage efficiency. Contemporary diaries describe peasants eating sawdust or grinding old bones into flour, while wolves grew bold enough to snatch children from besieged cities. The war's death toll, some 8 million, wasn't just from battle, but from the cold-induced famines that followed in its wake. Tree rings from German oaks tell the grim story. The worst growth years in centuries coincided exactly with the conflict's bloodiest phases. Meanwhile, across the globe, China's Ming Dynasty faced its own collapse under eerily similar pressures. The monsoon rains faltered, then failed entirely in the 1630s, triggering the worst drought in 500 years. In the northern provinces, locust swarms descended on the withered remains of crops, while cannibalism became so widespread that officials posted warnings against exchanging children to eat. The desperate peasantry rallied behind rebel leaders like Lai Zicheng, whose ragtag army marched on Beijing under banners that read, "Heaven has abandoned the Ming." When the capital fell in 1644, the last Ming emperor hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City, his suicide note blaming not rebels or invaders, but the heavens themselves for withholding rain. But the crisis wasn't confined to Eurasia. In Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire grappled with the Selali revolt's peasant uprisings fueled by grain shortages that killed over 100,000. Japan's Tokugawa shogunate saw the Kanei Great Famine claim 500,000 lives after volcanic eruptions exacerbated the cooling. Even the fledgling English colonies in North America nearly starved during the starving time of 1609 to 1610, when Jamestown settlers resorted to eating rats and, in one gruesome case, a disinterred corpse. What made this global catastrophe so unprecedented was its synchronicity. Ice cores from Greenland, sediment samples from Chinese lakes, and even records of Nile flood levels all point to the same conclusion. The 17th century was a climatic perfect storm. Increased volcanic activity, like the 1660 eruption of Indonesia's Long Island, spewed sunlight blocking ash into the atmosphere, while changes in ocean currents amplified the cooling. The result was a world where, from Paris to Peking, the average temperature dropped by 2 degrees Celsius, enough to shorten growing seasons by critical weeks. Yet amidst the suffering, the crisis also forged unexpected resilience. In the Netherlands, farmers pioneered crop rotation and greenhouse-like orangeries to extend growing seasons, laying the groundwork for modern agriculture. The Ming's collapse gave rise to the Qing Dynasty, which implemented massive grain storage systems to hedge against future famines. And in England, the turmoil accelerated the shift from feudalism to market economies, as landlords realized starving tenants couldn't pay rent in grain. The 17th century's agony holds a mirror to our own climate anxieties. Like our ancestors, we face a world where ecological shifts amplify social fractures, where droughts and floods don't just damage infrastructure, but destabilize governments. Their story reminds us that climate is never just about weather. It's about how societies respond when the old rules break. The difference is they didn't see the cold coming. We have no such excuse. In June 1783, the ground in Iceland split open like a seam under pressure, unleashing a volcanic fury unlike anything Europe had seen in centuries. The Laki fissure didn't erupt with a single explosive bang. It oozed death slowly, methodically, over 8 grueling months. Molten rock wasn't the real killer. It was the invisible poison seeping into the sky. Sulfur dioxide billowed from the fissure in suffocating waves, a toxic fog that twisted its way across the continent on high-altitude winds. Farmers in England first noticed the haze as an odd, bluish tint to the sunlight. Then their crops began to wither, leaves curled and blackened as if scorched by an unseen flame, while sheep collapsed in their pastures, their lungs seared by acid rain. By autumn, the stench of rotting vegetation hung so thick over France that courtiers at Versailles tied perfumed handkerchiefs over their noses. The numbers defy belief. Laki spewed an estimated 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide, enough to lower global temperatures by over 1 degree Celsius. In Iceland itself, a quarter of the population perished from starvation or fluoride poisoning as livestock died en masse. But the disaster's reach extended far beyond the North Atlantic. German vineyards reported grapes shriveled on the vine, their skins burned by chemical fallout. Italian silk harvests failed when mulberry trees, the sole food source for silkworms, succumbed to the haze. Even the Nile's annual flood, that ancient pulse of Egyptian life, arrived weakly that year, its waters tainted with ash carried on high-altitude winds. Yet the most explosive consequence unfolded not in fields or rivers, but in the breadlines of Paris. France had already teetered on the edge of financial ruin from supporting the American Revolution, and now nature delivered the cruelest blow. The summer of 1783 was among the coldest in memory, with frosts lingering into June. Wheat yields plummeted by nearly 40%, sending bread prices soaring to obscene levels. Starving mobs began attacking grain convoys, while rumors swirled that aristocrats were hoarding flour to drive up profits. Marie Antoinette's apocryphal "let them eat cake" remark, likely never uttered, nonetheless captured the rage of a populace choking on volcanic fumes while their rulers dined in extravagance. Historians still debate how directly Laki fueled the French Revolution, but the timing is chilling. The eruption's climatic effects peaked in 1788, precisely when drought and hailstorms ravaged France's remaining harvests, triggering the worst famine in decades. By July 1789, Parisians were storming the Bastille, their desperation crystallized by years of hunger. Revolutionary pamphlets of the era didn't mention Icelandic volcanoes, but they railed against the aristocratic meteor that had brought misery to the masses. In hindsight, Laki's true legacy wasn't just the toxic fog it unleashed, but the way it exposed the brittle foundations of an unequal society. When bread disappeared from markets and children wailed with empty bellies, no amount of royal decrees could patch the cracks in the old order. The eruption's fingerprints linger in unexpected places. Artist Philip James de Loutherbourg's paintings from the period show eerie, sulfur-yellow skies, a palette shift some attribute to volcanic haze. Benjamin Franklin, serving as U.S. ambassador to France, penned essays speculating about the dry fog and its climatic effects, marking one of the first attempts to link volcanoes to weather. And in Iceland itself, poet John Steingrimsson famously preached his fire sermon as lava neared his village, after which the flow miraculously halted, a moment still celebrated as a divine intervention. Laki's story is more than a geologic event. It's a case study in how environmental shocks can amplify human instability. The French Revolution would have likely happened without volcanic interference. Social tensions had been simmering for decades, but Laki turned the heat to full boil. When crops fail and stomachs empty, abstract ideas about liberty and equality suddenly become urgent demands. As we confront our own era of climate disruption, the lesson whispers across the centuries: civilization is fragile, and sometimes all it takes is one angry fissure in the earth to remind us who's really in charge. The first signs came in the summer of 1876, when the monsoon clouds that usually drenched India's parched plains simply never arrived. By August, the Ganges had shrunk to a trickle, its sacred waters replaced by cracked mudflats where corpses of cattle baked in the sun. But this was no isolated tragedy. The same drought was strangling northern China, where the Yellow River's flow dwindled to its lowest in living memory. What unfolded next would become known as the Great Drought, a catastrophe that claimed an estimated 30 million lives across Asia. And the cruelest twist: colonial bureaucracies turned nature's cruelty into a man-made slaughterhouse. In British-ruled India, the suffering was compounded by policies straight out of an economic horror story. Viceroy Lord Lytton, obsessed with free market dogma, continued exporting wheat to England even as villagers starved. Relief camps required workers to trudge miles for meager rations, often collapsing on the journey back. Photographs from the era show ghostly figures with hollow cheeks and distended bellies, their skeletal hands clutching empty bowls. One British official famously quipped that the famine was a necessary check on population growth, a sentiment that laid bare the empire's chilling calculus. Meanwhile, in China's Qing Dynasty, corruption siphoned off grain reserves meant for disaster relief. Peasants in Henan province resorted to eating clay mixed with seeds, a desperate measure that swelled their stomachs before killing them slowly. The drought's fingerprints were etched into the very landscape. Tree rings from the Himalayas show 1877 as the driest year in 6 centuries, while Chinese court records describe locust swarms so thick they blotted out the sun. But what made this disaster historically unique wasn't just the weather. It was the collision of climate with colonialism's ruthless machinery. Railways built to extract resources now carried grain away from starving regions. Tax collectors, indifferent to the crisis, demanded payments in silver even as currency values evaporated alongside crops. In Madras, where the death toll topped 5 million, survivors told of British soldiers guarding grain depots while children gnawed on tree bark outside. Yet amid the horror, the drought birthed unexpected resistance. In India, it galvanized early nationalist movements, with figures like Dadabhai Naoroji citing the famine as proof of colonial exploitation. His drain of wealth theory, that Britain siphoned off India's resources, found grim validation in grain ships sailing past emaciated crowds. China's catastrophe similarly weakened the king, fueling rebellions that would culminate in the dynasty's collapse decades later. Both empires learned too late that starving subjects make poor subjects indeed. Today, the Great Drought stands as a dark landmark in climate history, not just for its body count, but for its lesson about power and vulnerability. Modern climate models suggest such megadroughts were once rare, occurring maybe once every 500 years. But with rising temperatures altering monsoon patterns, scientists warn they could become frighteningly frequent. The difference this time: we can't blame Victorian-era policies. The choices we make about resource distribution, disaster preparedness, and global equity will determine whether future droughts are tragedies or crimes. The mercury climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the roads began to melt. In January 1939, as Australians sweltered through what newspapers dubbed the Black Friday heatwave, tar on Melbourne streets turned sticky as glue, trapping shoes and bicycle tires. Birds fell dead from trees, their tiny bodies baked mid-flight. But the real horror unfolded in the bush, where tinder-dry eucalyptus forests erupted into firestorms so intense they created their own weather-towering pyrocumulus clouds that rained embers miles ahead of the flames. By the time the infernos burned out, 71 people were dead, entire towns reduced to ashes, and a nation that had prided itself on taming a harsh land was forced to reckon with nature's fury. This wasn't an isolated event. The 1930s saw Australia gripped by a series of furnace days, each more brutal than the last. In 1938, the outback town of Burke endured 54 straight days above 100 degrees, a streak so extreme that thermometers cracked. Hospitals overflowed with heatstroke victims, their bodies unable to sweat fast enough to cool themselves. Newspapers printed warnings to avoid touching metal doorknobs barehanded, lest the searing heat blister skin. Yet the most devastating toll was invisible, a psychological toll as farmers watched generations of topsoil turn to dust and blow away in relentless duster winds. What made these heat waves historically significant wasn't just their intensity, but how they forced Australia to confront its environmental blind spots. For decades, settlers had clear-cut native vegetation, assuming European farming methods could conquer the arid landscape. The heat exposed that arrogance. Without deep-rooted native plants to hold moisture, soils desiccated into powder. Without shade-giving trees, livestock collapsed in fields. The crisis spurred radical policy shifts, the creation of soil conservation boards, restrictions on land clearing, and even early experiments with cool roof paints to reflect sunlight. These weren't just practical measures, they marked a cultural turning point, a recognition that adapting to the land was wiser than fighting it. The 1930s heatwaves also offered a chilling preview of climate extremes to come. Modern analysis of weather records shows that Australia's furnace days aligned with a global spike in temperatures, possibly linked to rising greenhouse gases from industrialization. Sound familiar today as Sydney and Melbourne regularly shatter heat records? Those 1930s disasters look less like freak events and more like grim signposts. The difference is today's heat waves unfold against a backdrop of air conditioning and advanced forecasting luxuries that can mask but not eliminate the underlying vulnerability. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of those scorching years lies in the stories. Aboriginal communities who had thrived in the outback for millennia shared ancient survival knowledge like digging cool underground shelters called wilgies or tracking water sources through bird behavior. Their wisdom, long ignored by settlers, suddenly held life-saving value. Meanwhile, artists like Russell Drysdale captured the eerie beauty of the sun-baked landscape, their paintings tinged with both awe and foreboding. The heatwaves didn't just reshape policies, they seared themselves into Australia's identity, a reminder that this is a land of fire as much as flood. As we face our own era of climate extremes, the 1930s offer more than historical curiosity, they're a masterclass in resilience. The solutions pioneered then, from water-saving drip irrigation to fire breaks inspired by indigenous burning practices, are now frontline defenses against a hotter world. But the deeper lesson is humility. Australia's furnace days taught that no technology or policy can fully insulate us from nature's wrath. Sometimes survival means listening to the land itself and remembering that the hottest days aren't just weather. Their warnings. The explosion was heard over 1,000 miles away, but its true devastation unfolded silently in the years that followed. When Mount Tambora blew itself apart in April 1815, it didn't just unleash the infamous year without a summer, it set off a chain reaction of suffering that stretched far beyond frozen crops and gloomy skies. The volcano ejected so much sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that it birthed a new kind of climate chaos, one where microscopic particles became invisible assassins. As the ash cloud circled the globe, it didn't just block sunlight, it altered rainfall patterns in ways that turned entire regions into breeding grounds for disease. In the Ganges Delta, where monsoon rains typically flushed contaminants into the Bay of Bengal, the sudden drought allowed stagnant water to fester with bacteria. By 1817, cholera, a disease previously confined to small outbreaks, exploded into its first global pandemic. British troops carried it from India to Nepal, then to Muscat and beyond. By the time it reached Europe in 1830, the death toll surpassed millions. Modern epidemiologists studying ice core data found a chilling correlation. The cholera bacterium thrives in warm, brackish water, precisely the conditions created when Tambora's ash disrupted normal evaporation cycles. A volcano in Indonesia had indirectly rewritten the map of human health. Meanwhile, the economic aftershocks rolled across oceans like seismic waves. In New England, where farmers had already fled the frozen fields of 1816, textile mills ground to a halt as European demand for cloth collapsed. The price of oats critical for feeding urban horses quadrupled in London, paralyzing transport. Even the whaling industry, then at its peak, suffered as ships returning from the Pacific reported bizarrely thickened fog that obscured navigation. The global economy, still fragile in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, tipped into a depression that lasted until the 1820s. In Switzerland, where glaciers advanced relentlessly, villagers spoke of the years the world forgot, as if time itself had frozen solid. Yet Tambora's most insidious legacy might be its impact on human migration. In southern China, where failed rice harvests triggered the Panthay Rebellion, displaced farmers joined insurgent armies rather than starve. Ireland's potato blight, though often blamed solely on fungal spores, was worsened by the cold, damp summers. Tambora engineered a prelude to the Great Famine decades later. Even the American Midwest saw an unexpected population boom, as families fleeing New England's frosts became early pioneers of the fertile Ohio Valley. The volcano didn't just kill, it pushed and pulled humanity like tides. Today, Tambora's lesson reverberates through climate models and pandemic preparedness plans. Scientists now know that major eruptions can suppress hurricane formation in the Atlantic, while intensifying typhoons in the Pacific, proof that nature's systems are knotted together in ways we're still unraveling. When Yellowstone's geysers sputter or Iceland's volcanoes grumble, policymakers don't just fear lava flows, they stockpile grain and update quarantine protocols. Because the deadliest eruptions aren't the ones that bury cities in ash, but the ones that quietly unstitch the delicate web of weather, trade, and health we call civilization. Tambora didn't just darken skies, it exposed how thin the line between stability and chaos really is, and how deeply we're all entangled in the same atmospheric dance. High in the Peruvian Andes, a mountain that few outside the region had ever heard of suddenly ripped itself apart with apocalyptic fury. On February 19, 1600, Huenaputina, whose name translates ominously as New Volcano, erupted with such violence that it ejected an estimated 12 cubic miles of ash and gas into the sky. The blast was heard over 250 miles away in Lima, where terrified residents reported flaming rocks raining from the heavens. But the real devastation unfolded half a world away, where the volcano's invisible fingerprints would topple empires and rewrite history. The eruption's climatic impact was swift and merciless. Sulfur dioxide particles formed a reflective veil around the planet, bending sunlight back into space. Global temperatures plummeted by up to 2 degrees Celsius, a seemingly small number with catastrophic consequences. In Russia, where summers were already perilously short, the growing season shrank by critical weeks. Frosts in July blackened wheat fields across the Muscovy region, while early autumn snows buried what little harvest remained. By winter, starving peasants flooded into Moscow, their skeletal frames bearing witness to a famine so severe that chroniclers reported instances of cannibalism in the countryside. This was no ordinary food shortage, it was the spark that ignited Russia's time of troubles, a 15-year spiral of civil war, foreign invasion, and dynastic collapse. With no grain to tax, the government of Tsar Boris Godunov teetered into bankruptcy. Pretenders to the throne emerged, each claiming to be Dmitry, the murdered youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. Polish armies exploited the chaos, seizing Moscow in 1610. The resulting death toll, some estimates suggest 2 million perished, wasn't just from hunger, but from the complete unraveling of social order. Tree rings from Siberian pines tell the grim story. 1601 were the worst growth years in 6 centuries, their stunted rings mirroring the desperation in Russian scrolls pleading for bread to quiet the people's rage. Yet Huenaputina's reach extended far beyond Russia. In France, vineyards recorded their latest harvests in living memory, the grapes struggling to ripen under ash-dimmed skies. Chinese imperial records note summer frosts devastating mulberry crops, crippling the silk trade for years. Even the Jamestown colonists, thousands of miles from Peru, suffered through the starving time winter of 1609 to 1610, when rations dwindled to half a cup of barley per day, a crisis likely exacerbated by the volcano's global cooling. What makes Huenaputina's story so compelling isn't just its scale, but its anonymity. Unlike Pompeii's dramatic demise or Krakatoa's infamous roar, this Peruvian catastrophe unfolded quietly, its true impact hidden in the threads of distant political collapses. Modern ice cores from Greenland reveal its sulfur signature as one of the strongest in the past millennium. Yet for centuries, the volcano itself was little more than a local legend. The lesson here is as relevant today as it was 4 centuries ago. In our interconnected world, disaster wears no borders. A mountain few could locate on a map altered the destiny of nations, proving that climate is the silent architect of history's most pivotal moments. When harvests fail and stomachs empty, even the mightiest dynasties are just one volcanic winter away from oblivion. Huenaputina didn't just erupt, it whispered, and empires fell. The morning of June 30th, 1908, began like any other in the remote Siberian wilderness until the sky split open with a force that defied comprehension. At 7:17 a.m., reindeer herders near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River saw a blinding blue-white streak tear across the heavens, followed by a series of thunderous explosions that knocked men off their feet and sent shockwaves rippling across continents. Seismographs in England recorded tremors equivalent to a 5.0 earthquake, while air pressure spikes were detected as far away as London. But the most astonishing sight awaited those who dared venture into the epicenter. 800 square miles of ancient forest reduced to matchsticks, every tree felled in a radial pattern like spokes on a wheel, their trunks charred and stripped of branches. This wasn't just an explosion, it was the largest impact event in recorded history, and it left no crater. For decades, the Tunguska event baffled scientists. Without an obvious impact site, theories ranged from a comet fragment vaporizing in mid-air to a rogue black hole, or even Nikola Tesla's secret energy experiments gone awry. Only in the 21st century did advanced modeling reveal the likely culprit, a stony meteorite, roughly 120 feet wide, that detonated 5 miles above the ground with the force of 10 to 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima's atomic bomb. The blast's heat ignited wildfires 60 miles away while shockwaves circled the globe twice. Yet because it struck one of the most uninhabited places on Earth, the death toll was astonishingly low, perhaps as few as 3 people. Had the meteor arrived just 4 hours later, its trajectory would have put it on a collision course with St. Petersburg, obliterating the imperial capital and 500,000 souls in an instant. The Tunguska event's true legacy lies in its terrifying what-if scenario. In 1908, humanity had no space telescopes tracking near-Earth objects, no planetary defense strategies, not even a basic understanding of asteroid threats. Had the meteor struck a major European city, it could have derailed the already tense geopolitical landscape on the eve of World War I, potentially altering the course of 20th century history. Instead, it became a wake-up call written in flattened trees and scorched earth. Today, NASA, a planetary defense coordination office, monitors over 20,000 near-Earth asteroids, with deflection technologies like the Drought mission testing our ability to nudge threats off course. But Tunguska reminds us that cosmic roulette is always in play, and our survival may one day depend on spotting the next visitor before it spots us. What makes this event so chilling isn't just the scale of destruction, but the randomness of its timing. The meteor struck during the day when most witnesses were outdoors had it arrived at night. Its true nature might have remained a mystery forever. Indigenous Evenki tribes who believed the blast was the wrath of the fire god Ogdi avoided the area for generations, their oral traditions preserving details that aligned eerily with later scientific findings. Even now, the Tunguska site draws researchers hunting for microscopic diamond fragments, the only traces of a space rock that vanished without a trace, leaving behind a lesson as vast as the Siberian taiga. Earth orbits in a cosmic shooting gallery, and sometimes the difference between catastrophe and curiosity is just a matter of miles. On August 27, 1883, the island of Krakatoa ceased to exist in the span of 36 hours. The volcanic explosion was so colossal that it ruptured eardrums of sailors 40 miles away and sent barometers spinning wildly in London, over 11,000 miles distant. The sound wave circled the planet 4 times, a physical force detectable on instruments for 5 straight days. But this wasn't just geology's greatest performance. It was a global event that rewrote weather patterns, reshaped coastlines, and even altered how artists saw the world. The immediate aftermath played out like a disaster epic. Pyroclastic flows raced across the Sunda Strait at 700 miles per hour, vaporizing entire villages in seconds. Tsunamis towering over 100 feet slammed into Java and Sumatra, carrying steamships inland and leaving coral reefs strewn across rice fields. Official Dutch colonial records listed 36,000 dead, though modern historians estimate the true toll was likely double bodies washed up as far as East Africa. Yet the eruption's reach extended far beyond the archipelago. Ships in South Africa's Cape of Good Hope reported violent seas from waves radiating outward, while pumice rafts thick enough to walk on clogged harbors in Madagascar for months. But Krakatoa's most surprising legacy was written in the sky. The volcano injected 20 cubic kilometers of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a veil that scattered sunlight into surreal hues. For 3 years afterward, sunsets worldwide turned blood red and lavender, with vivid afterglows lasting hours. In New York, fire trucks were dispatched multiple times when panicked citizens mistook the crimson skies for distant infernos. Londoners gathered on bridges to watch the Thames shimmer with unnatural orange reflections. These optical phenomena weren't just curiosities, they became cultural touchstones. Artist William Scroft painted hundreds of Krakatoa skies over Chelsea, creating the first real-time record of atmospheric effects. Most famously, Edvard Munch's iconic The Scream was directly inspired by the volcanic twilight over Oslo, his diary describing how the sky turned blood red as he walked with friends gripped by existential dread. The climate impacts were equally profound. Global temperatures dropped by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 years, disrupting monsoon cycles and triggering bizarre weather. California recorded its snowiest winter ever in 1884, while Europe endured endless gray volcanic winters that devastated vineyards. In a bizarre twist, the ash-enhanced sunsets may have accelerated scientific discovery. Researchers studying the phenomena made breakthroughs in understanding atmospheric circulation, laying groundwork for modern meteorology. Krakatoa's eruption marked the dawn of our awareness that local disasters could have planetary consequences. Telegraph cables, then a new technology, spread news of the catastrophe within hours, making it the first globally mediated natural disaster. Scientists worldwide collaborated on thousands of reports, creating the template for modern volcanology. Even the arts were forever changed. The eruption's sonic boom inspired composers like Camille Saint-Saëns to experiment with dissonance in works like Danse Macabre. What makes Krakatoa unforgettable isn't just its violence, but its revelation of invisible connections, how a single geologic event could link Indonesian fishermen to Norwegian painters, monsoons to symphonies, destruction to creation. The volcano didn't just explode an island, it shattered humanity's illusion of separateness from nature's forces, proving that beauty and terror could emerge from the same fiery breath. Parisians woke on January 21, 1910, to a sight that seemed impossible. The Seine River, that familiar ribbon of blue winding through their city, had transformed into a monstrous brown torrent. Water poured over the embankments near the Gare d'Austerlitz, swallowing quayside bookstalls and creeping up the legs of the Zouave statue on the Pont de l'Alma, a traditional flood gauge. By week's end, the statue's waist was submerged, then its shoulders, until only its defiant chin remained above the rising tide. The city of light was drowning, its grand boulevards turned to canals, its metro tunnels gushing like fountains. The flood's origins lay in a relentless barrage of winter storms. Weeks of heavy rain and unseasonably warm temperatures had melted snowpack across northern France, funneling unimaginable volumes of water into the Seine's tributaries. But Paris's real vulnerability wasn't just the weather. It was the city's own urban fabric. Centuries of development had paved over natural floodplains, forcing the river into an ever narrower concrete straitjacket. When the waters came, they had nowhere to go but up. The Latin Quarter's labyrinthine streets became Venetian-style waterways, with residents rowing boats past café terraces where waiters had once served espresso. In the Louvre's basement, curators frantically hauled masterpieces to higher floors as seepage threatened Da Vinci's and Delacroix's. Even the electrically powered omnibuses, the pride of modern transit, stood paralyzed, their motors short-circuited by the flood. Yet amid the chaos emerged moments of surreal beauty. Photographers captured reflections of the Eiffel Tower rippling in flooded avenues, while enterprising gondoliers from Venice arrived to ferry Parisians in flat-bottomed boats. Beneath the surface, though, the crisis exposed terrifying gaps in preparedness. With no centralized warning system, many families only realized the danger when water lapped at their doorsteps. The flood crested at 8.62 meters over 28 feet on January 28, a record that still stands. Over 200,000 Parisians were displaced, and the economic toll topped 400 million francs, a staggering sum for the era. The disaster's true legacy, however, wasn't measured in damage but in transformation. Engineer Hubert Latham famously took to the skies in a biplane to survey the inundation, marking one of the first uses of aerial photography for disaster assessment. His images revealed how the city's haphazard growth had exacerbated the flooding, sparking a radical rethink of urban planning. Over the next decade, Paris constructed massive reservoirs upstream to absorb excess rainfall, widened river channels, and installed an intricate network of floodgates. Most crucially, officials established the Service de Prévision des Crues, a pioneering flood forecasting system that became a model for cities worldwide. What makes the Great Flood so pivotal isn't just the scale of suffering, but how it married old wisdom with new technology. Medieval Parisians had known to build on high ground. Their ancestors' elevated Isle de la Cité remained largely dry. But 20th century engineers added a critical innovation: the understanding that rivers must be managed as entire watersheds, not just controlled within city limits. Today, when the Seine threatens to rise, sensors from Burgundy to Normandy feed real-time data into predictive models, buying precious hours for preparation. The flood also reshaped culture in unexpected ways. Marcel Proust, then writing remembrance of things past, wove descriptions of the disaster into his fictional universe. Artists like Pierre Bonnard found inspiration in the play of light on watery streets, while satirical postcards depicted fish visiting museums. Even the city's infamous rats, driven from sewers by the deluge, became symbols of resilience or menace depending on one's perspective. As climate change increases the frequency of extreme weather, Paris's 1910 nightmare offers both warning and hope. The automated flood barriers installed in recent decades were tested dramatically in 2018, when the Seine again surged to 5.8 meters, high enough to halt river traffic and threaten museums, but far below the catastrophe of a century prior. The difference, a simple but profound shift, from fighting the river's nature to working with it. Sometimes it takes a great flood to remind us that water, like history, cannot be contained, only understood and respected. The first warnings came quietly, in the fading green of millet fields and the shrinking waterholes where cattle once gathered at dusk. By the early 1970s, the Sahel, a fragile belt of semi-arid land separating the Sahara Desert from Africa's tropical forests, was unraveling under a drought that would stretch for decades. This wasn't just a bad season, it was a slow-motion disaster, one that would displace over 10 million people and rewrite the map of an entire region. And its roots reached far beyond the shifting sands of the Sahara. Scientists now recognize the Sahel drought as one of the first climate crises where human activity played a starring role. Overgrazing and deforestation had stripped the land of vegetation, reducing the Earth's ability to retain moisture. But the real catalyst came from distant industrial smokestacks and car tailpipes. Aerosols from Europe and North America drifted south, altering atmospheric circulation patterns and pushing the monsoon rains farther away from the Sahel. The result, rainfall decreased by up to 40% in some areas, turning grasslands to dust and sending nomadic herders on desperate treks southward. In Niger, Lake Chad, once a vital resource for 4 countries, shrank to a tenth of its 1960s size, its exposed lakebed becoming a stark symbol of ecological collapse. The human toll was staggering. In Ethiopia, images of emaciated children with hollow eyes shocked the world, though the crisis had been building for years before cameras arrived. Families who had farmed the same land for generations watched their crops wither, then packed what little they could carry and joined the growing stream of climate refugees. But unlike sudden disasters, earthquakes or floods, this exodus unfolded in slow motion, making it easier for the world to look away. By the time international aid arrived, many were already dead, their bodies buried in unmarked graves along migration routes. Yet the drought's most enduring legacy wasn't just the hunger, it was the conflict it seeded. As herders pushed south into farming territories, competition over dwindling resources turned violent. In Sudan, clashes between nomadic groups and settled farmers escalated into full-blown wars, foreshadowing the Darfur genocide decades later. Mauritania expelled tens of thousands of black African pastoralists, accusing them of straining resources, while Mali and Burkina Faso saw ethnic tensions flare into rebellions. These weren't random eruptions of violence, They were the inevitable consequence of a climate under siege, where survival meant fighting for scraps. What makes the Sahel crisis so haunting is how it mirrors our current climate predicaments, just on a slower scale. Scientists studying tree rings and lake sediments later confirmed that the 1970s drought was the worst in the region in over 1,000 years. But rather than a freak occurrence, it was a preview. Today, as temperatures rise and deserts expand, the Sahel story feels less like history and more like prophecy. The difference now, we can't claim ignorance. The warning signs, vanishing lakes, shifting rain patterns, displaced populations, are all around us, written in the dust of a region that never fully recovered. The Sahel drought didn't just create refugees, it revealed how deeply human destiny is tied to the whims of climate. When the rains fail, borders blur, identities fracture, and the thin veneer of stability cracks under the weight of necessity. Those who survived didn't do so through resilience alone, but by adapting in ways that reshaped societies forever. Some turned to urban slums, trading nomadic traditions for precarious jobs. Others mastered drought and farming techniques, coaxing life from near barren soil. Their struggles offer no easy lessons, only a stark reminder that climate change isn't a future threat. It's a force that's been rewriting human stories for decades, one parched field at a time. The summer of 2003 painted Europe in shades of heat never before seen in living memory. In Paris, thermometers hit a staggering 104 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature the city's aging infrastructure was never designed to endure. Hospitals overflowed as emergency rooms became makeshift morgues, their refrigeration units overwhelmed by the sheer volume of bodies. Meanwhile, in London, asphalt on the roads softened underfoot, buckling like melted chocolate. But the most chilling statistic emerged later: over 70,000 lives lost across the continent, many of them elderly and alone in apartments without air conditioning, their bodies undiscovered for days. This wasn't just a heatwave, it was a mass casualty event hiding in plain sight. What made the catastrophe so devastating wasn't just the record-breaking temperatures, but the way it exposed societal blind spots. France's healthcare system, often lauded as one of the world's best, crumbled under the strain. Morgues ran out of space, forcing authorities to store bodies in refrigerated trucks normally used for fresh produce. The crisis hit hardest at night, when urban heat islands, concrete and asphalt radiating stored warmth, prevented temperatures from dropping below 80 degrees, offering no respite. In Italy, officials scrambled to organize emergency funerals as the death toll in Rome alone surpassed 3,000. The heatwave didn't discriminate by wealth, but it preyed mercilessly on the isolated and vulnerable, revealing how easily modern systems could fail when nature defied expectations. Yet the disaster's true legacy lay in its aftermath. Meteorologists analyzing weather patterns identified something alarming. The 2003 heatwave wasn't a freak occurrence but a preview. Climate models showed such extremes becoming 5 times more likely by mid-century. Cities that had prided themselves on cobblestone charm and historic architecture suddenly faced a brutal reckoning. Their very design was a liability. Paris responded by creating a registry of at-risk residents, with volunteers conducting wellness checks during heat alerts. Germany redesigned hospitals with shaded courtyards and natural ventilation, while Sweden began painting rooftops white to reflect sunlight. These weren't just policy tweaks, they were admissions that the old normal was gone. Perhaps the most poignant lesson emerged from the stories of survival. In southern France, villagers revived ancient practices like closing shutters during the day and sleeping in stone-walled basements. Croatian winemakers, whose ancestors had cultivated heat-resistant grape varietals, found their vineyards faring better than industrial farms. The crisis underscored a paradox of modernity. Sometimes the most effective solutions aren't cutting-edge technology, but forgotten wisdom. As temperatures continue to climb globally, the 2003 heatwave stands as both warning and blueprint. It proved that heat kills silently, without the drama of hurricanes or floods, but just as lethally. And it revealed that resilience isn't just about air conditioning and emergency protocols. It's about reimagining how we build, how we care for one another, and how we honor the delicate balance between human progress and planetary limits. The 70,000 who perished left behind more than tragedy. They left a roadmap for survival in the hotter, harder world we've created. The summer of 2010 turned Russia into a tinderbox. For weeks, a stagnant heat dome parked itself over western regions, pushing temperatures in Moscow above 100 degrees, something the city had recorded only once before in its entire history. But the real disaster wasn't just the sweltering air, it was what the heat unleashed. Peat bogs surrounding the capital, long drained for agriculture, smoldered underground like buried embers, blanketing the city in toxic smoke so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Hospital admissions for respiratory failure skyrocketed, while morgues stacked bodies 3 deep as mortality rates doubled. Yet the flames licking at Russia's heart were just the spark. The real firestorm would spread far beyond its borders, igniting a chain reaction of hunger and unrest across continents. At the heart of the crisis lay Russia's decimated wheat harvest. As the world's third largest exporter, the country normally supplied Egypt with half its grain, Tunisia with 30%, and Libya with nearly all of theirs. But with fields reduced to cracked earth and wildfires devouring storage silos, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin made a fateful decision: a total ban on wheat exports. Overnight, global prices rocketed by 80%, hitting record highs for millions in the Middle East and North Africa, where bread constituted a third of daily calories. This wasn't just inflation, it was existential. In Cairo, the price of flatbread, a staple for the poor, tripled in months. Protesters in Yemen took to the streets chanting, "They feed us bullets while they eat bread." While in Algeria, riots over flour shortages left 5 dead and hundreds injured. The political tinder was already dry. Decades of corruption, unemployment, and repression had left populations simmering with discontent. But the sudden bread crisis turned simmer to boil. Scholars analyzing the Arab Spring's timeline found a chilling correlation. The revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt erupted precisely as food inflation peaked. Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor whose self-immolation sparked the uprising, wasn't just protesting police harassment. He'd watched his ability to feed his family evaporate alongside grain reserves. In Syria, where drought had already displaced rural farmers to cities, the added strain of imported wheat shortages exacerbated tensions that would later explode into civil war. Climate didn't cause these revolutions, but it lit the match. What made the Russian heatwave so historically significant wasn't just its meteorological brutality, though that was unprecedented, with scientists later calculating it was 3 times more likely due to climate change, but how it revealed the fragility of globalized food systems. Modern agriculture relies on just a handful of breadbasket regions, and when one falters, the shockwaves ripple outward. The crisis also exposed how autocratic regimes, despite their control over security forces, are often helpless against nature's whims. Putin's approval ratings plummeted as wildfires raged, proving that even strongmen can't command the rain. Yet the most enduring lesson lies in the unexpected connections the heatwave unveiled. A failed harvest in the Volga region could topple dictators in Tunis. Smoke from Siberian fires could close airports in Istanbul. In our interconnected world, climate disruption doesn't respect borders. It weaves them into a single, vulnerable tapestry. The 2010 heatwave wasn't just a Russian tragedy. It was a dry run for the era of cascading consequences we now inhabit, where the weather report might as well be a political forecast. And as temperatures continue to rise, its message grows ever clearer. The climate isn't just changing our environment, it's rewriting the rules of power. The skies turned an apocalyptic shade of orange as flames taller than skyscrapers raced across the Australian landscape with terrifying speed. The 2019 to 2020 bushfire season wasn't just bad, it rewrote the rulebook on what nature could unleash in a warming world. By the time the last embers cooled, over 46 million acres had burned, an area larger than Syria or Portugal, leaving behind a charred wasteland where ancient rainforests once stood. But the true horror wasn't measured in hectares alone. Ecologists estimate 3 billion animals perished or were displaced, their habitats reduced to ash in what became known as the Black Summer. Koalas, already vulnerable from habitat loss, burned alive in gum trees that normally protected them, their desperate cries haunting firefighters who could do nothing but watch. What made these fires different wasn't just their scale, but their behavior. Flames generated their own weather systems, pyrocumulonimbus clouds that spat lightning into dry forests, sparking new blazes kilometers ahead of the main front. In the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, firefighters battled flames that leaped across 8-lane highways as if they were mere cracks in the pavement. The town of Malakuta became a global symbol of the catastrophe when 4,000 residents and tourists were forced to shelter on the beach as an eerie red darkness swallowed the coastline, their only escape coming by naval ships evacuating them through smoke-choked waters. Meanwhile, in Canberra, the air quality index hit 20 times the hazardous level, turning the capital into the most polluted city on Earth, worse than Delhi or Beijing on their worst days. The fires exposed uncomfortable truths about humanity's relationship with nature in the Anthropocene. While Australia's eucalyptus forests had evolved with fire, some species even requiring it to germinate, the intensity and frequency of these blazes far exceeded natural cycles. A 3-year drought had turned vegetation into tinder, while record-breaking temperatures reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit created conditions unlike anything in recorded history. But human fingerprints were all over the disaster. Land clearing had fragmented wildlife corridors, leaving animals with nowhere to flee, while decades of suppressing smaller fires allowed dangerous fuel loads to accumulate. Even the timing defied norms. Fires typically peaked in late summer, but these ignited in spring and kept raging into autumn, a terrifying expansion of what scientists now call fire weather season. Amid the devastation emerged stories of astonishing resilience. Firefighters from as far away as Canada and the United States joined the battle, working 90-hour shifts in conditions that melted truck tires. Volunteers formed animal rescue armies, crafting makeshift mittens for burned koala paws and setting up wildlife triage centers in school gyms. On Kangaroo Island, conservationists performed emergency surgeries on endangered glossy black cockatoos, their feathers singed but their will to survive mirroring that of the humans trying to save them. These moments of hope couldn't outweigh the staggering losses. Entire species like the Kangaroo Island Drought teetered on the brink, their last populations decimated, but they revealed the depth of our connection to a world we're simultaneously destroying and fighting to protect. The Black Summer fires didn't just change Australia, they altered global perceptions of climate catastrophe. Images of Sydney's Opera House shrouded in smoke made front pages worldwide, becoming visual shorthand for the climate emergency. Insurers tallied over $2.5 billion in claims, a number that forced even skeptical politicians to acknowledge the economic toll of inaction. Most hauntingly, researchers later discovered the fires had lofted so much smoke into the stratosphere that it circled the southern hemisphere for months, potentially accelerating the melting of glaciers in New Zealand by darkening their surfaces. A disaster that began in Australian forests had literally changed the color of the sky halfway around the world. As survivors rebuild, the legacy of those flames lingers not just in scarred landscapes, but in our collective understanding of what's possible. The 2019 to 2020 fires weren't an aberration. They were a preview, a glimpse into a future where climate extremes rewrite the rules of nature faster than we can adapt. When centuries-old rainforests that never burned before go up in smoke, when firestorms generate their own lightning, when the very air becomes unbreathable, we're no longer observing climate change. We're living inside its unfolding story, one where the next chapter depends on choices we make today. The Black Summer didn't just scorch the earth, it burned away illusions of safety, leaving behind an urgent question: how many more warning signs do we need before we truly act? The thermostat read 121 degrees, a number so absurd it might have been a prank. Except the air outside felt like a blast furnace. In June 2021, a heat dome of staggering intensity parked itself over the Pacific Northwest, a region more accustomed to drizzle than desert-like extremes. Portland, Oregon, where summer highs typically linger in the 70s, shattered its all-time record 3 days in a row, peaking at a mine bending 116 degrees. Lytton, British Columbia, a village nestled in mountains where residents rarely saw 90 degrees hit 121 before being incinerated by wildfires the next day. This wasn't just unusual weather. It was a climate anomaly so severe that statisticians calculated its likelihood at once in 10,000 years. Yet here it was, unfolding in real time on weather apps and car dashboards. What made the heat dome so terrifying wasn't just the broken records, but who was breaking them. The Pacific Northwest's infrastructure and culture were built around cool, maritime norms. Less than half of Portland homes had air conditioning, leaving families to swelter in attic bedrooms or line up at emergency cooling centers. Pavement buckled on highways, power cables sagged under unprecedented demand, and streetcar rails warped into useless curves. Meanwhile, the region's famed natural bounty turned lethal. Coastal tides cooked millions of mussels and clams alive in their shells, while salmon, already struggling in warming rivers, suffered fatal oxygen depletion as water temperatures surpassed 80 degrees. Even the towering Douglas firs, symbols of the region's resilience, dropped needles in stress, their drought-weakened roots unable to cope. Behind the scenes, scientists traced the disaster to a stalled jet stream pattern, a kink in the atmospheric river that trapped hot air like a lid on a pot. But climate change turned the burner up. Studies later confirmed human-caused warming made the heat dome at least 150 times more likely, a staggering attribution that erased any doubt about its origins. The victims told the story in stark numbers: over 1,000 deaths across the region, many among elderly or marginalized communities without cooling options. In Seattle's University District, a retired schoolteacher perished in her apartment when indoor temperatures reached 120 degrees, a space never designed for such extremes. Yet the heat dome's legacy extends beyond tragedy. It forced a reckoning with complacency. Cities that had prided themselves on environmental progress suddenly faced their own vulnerability. Portland launched a program to distribute free air conditioners to low-income residents, while Vancouver redesigned building codes to mandate heat pumps in new construction. Urban planners began painting rooftops reflective white and planting climate-resilient tree species along sidewalks. these weren't just policy tweaks, they were admissions that the old climate, the one these cities were built for, no longer existed. Most hauntingly, the event revealed how quickly the unimaginable becomes normal. Just 2 years later, another heatwave baked the same region, albeit slightly less severe. This time, fewer people died, not because the weather was kinder, but because collective memory had sharpened instincts. Neighbors checked on each other, cooling centers were better publicized, and households that could afford it had installed AC units. Adaptation, it turns out, isn't just about infrastructure, it's about the stories we tell ourselves. The 2021 heat dome didn't just break records, it shattered illusions, proving that even the rarest of events can become recurring nightmares in a world where the climate rulebook has been tossed out the window. As the planet warms, the lesson of the Pacific Northwest echoes globally. There are no safe zones anymore. Not in rainforests, not in temperate coasts, not in mountain valleys. The heat dome was a flashing red light on humanity's dashboard, warning that systems built for stability will falter under escalating volatility. And while the region's response offers glimmers of hope, it also underscores a brutal truth: survival in this new era won't be about restoring balance, but learning to endure the unendurable. The past's warnings are no longer distant prophecies. They're today's weather forecasts delivered in degrees we never thought we'd see. Picture a Sahara desert not of endless dunes, but of shimmering lakes and grasslands teeming with wildlife, a lush paradise where early humans thrived. This wasn't some alternate reality. It was Earth just 10,000 years ago during the African humid period. As the planet emerged from the last ice age, shifts in Earth's orbit triggered monsoons to drench North Africa for millennia, transforming the Sahara into a savanna crisscrossed by rivers. For our ancestors, this wasn't just a change of scenery, it was the stage for one of humanity's greatest leaps, the birth of agriculture. Along the banks of ancient waterways like the now vanished Lake Mega Chad, hunter-gatherers began experimenting with wild grains, their experiments eventually yielding domesticated crops like sorghum and millet. Climate didn't just nudge us toward farming, it handed us the tools to reinvent civilization itself. But the Sahara's greening was just one chapter in a much longer story. Rewind further to the Pleistocene ice ages, and you'll find climate playing a far more brutal role in shaping our species. As glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles spanning 80,000 years, early humans were forced to adapt or perish. The frigid pressures of these eras may explain our oversized brains' evolution's answer to the need for complex problem-solving. When edible plants vanished under ice, our ancestors turned to hunting megafauna, developing sophisticated tools like spear throwers and thermal clothing made from animal hides. Coastal populations stranded by falling sea levels discovered marine resources, enriching their diets with omega-3 fatty acids that potentially turbocharged cognitive development. Even our social bonds may have climate roots. Sharing food during harsh winters likely reinforced cooperation, laying the groundwork for modern society. The most striking evidence of climate's hand in our evolution lies in our genes. DNA studies reveal that populations isolated during glacial periods developed unique adaptations like the high-altitude endurance of Tibetans, whose EPAS1 gene mutation helps them thrive in thin mountain air, a trait that emerged after their ancestors migrated to the Tibetan Plateau during a warm interglacial period. Similarly, the lactose tolerance common in northern Europeans traces back to cold-adapted herding cultures that depended on dairy when crops failed. Climate didn't just shape where we lived, it rewrote our very biology to meet its challenges. Yet for all its trials, climate also offered golden opportunities. The warming period 14,000 years ago melted ice bridges but opened new coastlines, allowing humans to sail across Southeast Asia and populate Australia. Later, a brief cold snap called the Younger Dryas, which plunged temperatures back to Ice Age levels for 1,000 years, may have accelerated agricultural experimentation as traditional foraging became unreliable. Even volcanic winters played their part. The Tambora Eruption 74,000 years ago likely created a genetic bottleneck, leaving only the most resourceful survivors to repopulate the planet. What makes climate's role in human evolution so profound isn't just its past influence, but its ongoing dialogue with our species. The same adaptability that let us survive ice ages now fuels our ability to engineer solutions to modern climate change, from drought-resistant crops to solar technology. Yet there's irony in our success. The industrial prowess born from ancient climatic pressures now drives the very disruptions threatening our future. The Sahara's transformation from grassland to desert stands as a reminder: climate giveth, and climate taketh away. Our story has always been written in rain, ice, and wind. The question is whether we'll heed its lessons before the next great shift arrives. History doesn't just warn us, it hands us a survival manual written in the ashes of fallen empires and the ingenuity of those who endured. Take the Maya, who engineered vast reservoirs to weather dry spells, only to collapse when their systems couldn't scale to meet a centuries-long megadrought. Their story isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a challenge. Today, cities like Cape Town and Chennai flirt with day-zero water crises, repeating ancient mistakes by relying on finite reservoirs while overdrawing groundwater. Yet in Rajasthan, India, villagers revived 9th-century stepwells, intricate stone structures that capture monsoon rains, blending ancestral wisdom with modern conservation to turn parched lands back into fertile ground. Adaptation isn't about choosing between old and new, it's about weaving them together. The Dutch, living below sea level for centuries, offer another masterclass in resilience. After the 1953 North Sea flood drowned thousands, they didn't just build higher dikes, they reimagined their relationship with water. The Delta Works, a sprawling network of storm surge barriers and movable dams, lets rivers and tides flow naturally until threats loom, then seals the country shut like a fortress. This living with water philosophy now inspires floating neighborhoods in Amsterdam, where homes rise and fall with the tides. Compare this to Venice's MOSE project, a billion-dollar barrier system already crumbling under corruption and rising seas. And the lesson is clear: survival favors those who design with nature's rhythms, not against them. But resilience isn't just about grand engineering, it's etched into daily choices. In Bangladesh, farmers once devastated by cyclones now cultivate floating gardens, rafts of water hyacinths and bamboo that bear crops even during floods. This innovation, rooted in centuries-old practices, has turned climate refugees into climate pioneers. Meanwhile, California's megafires reveal the cost of ignoring indigenous knowledge. For millennia, Native American tribes like the Yurok used controlled burns to clear underbrush, creating fire-resistant landscapes. Only after catastrophic wildfires scorched millions of acres did modern forest services adopt these ancient techniques. The pattern is undeniable: the solutions we need often live in the past, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet adaptation alone isn't enough. The Akkadians and Romans thrived in stable climates, only to collapse when conditions shifted. Today, as Phoenix and Dubai push temperatures beyond livable limits, we're testing those same boundaries, banking on air conditioning to defy desert heat. But technology has limits, as Puerto Rico learned when Hurricane Maria wiped out its power grid, leaving hospitals sweltering without backup. True resilience demands redundancy. Solar microgrids paired with wind, drought-resistant crops alongside traditional strains, cities designed for both floods and heat waves. The Greenland Vikings vanished because they clung to European farming in an icy wilderness. Their Inuit neighbors survived by embracing sealskins and kayaks. Stubbornness is a luxury extinction can't afford. The most urgent lesson whispers from every collapsed civilization. Climate shifts aren't just disasters to survive, they're catalysts that reveal who we are. When the Little Ice Age froze Europe, it birthed the Enlightenment as survivors questioned old dogmas. When drought toppled the Tang Dynasty, it forced innovations like drought-tolerant rice that fed future generations. Our crisis is no different. The choices we make, whether to hoard resources or share them, to wall ourselves off or collaborate, will etch our legacy into the geologic record. The Maya's reservoirs and the Dutch's dikes aren't just relics, they're invitations. The next chapter of human history won't be written by the climate alone, but by how boldly we rewrite the rules of survival. From the rise and fall of empires to the brushstrokes of artists capturing ash-darkened skies, climate has been the silent choreographer of human destiny. These 29 events aren't just footnotes in history, they're flashing neon signs, warning us that civilizations thrive or collapse based on their relationship with the natural world. The Mayas' abandoned cities and the Dust Bowl's exodus teach the same brutal lesson. Ignore the climate's rhythms, and even the grandest societies become ruins. But buried in these catastrophes is also hope, proof of our species' astonishing adaptability. The Dutch didn't surrender to rising seas, they engineered floating homes. The survivors of the year without a summer didn't just endure, they created Frankenstein, a masterpiece born from darkness. What makes our moment different isn't the threat itself. Droughts and storms are as old as time, but our unprecedented power to shape the outcome. Unlike the Akkadians, we can see megadroughts coming through satellite data. Unlike medieval peasants, we have vaccines to prevent climate-driven plagues. But knowledge alone isn't enough. History's greatest failing wasn't a lack of technology. It was the arrogance of assuming temporary stability would last forever. Rome's granaries couldn't save it when the climate optimum ended, just as today's seawalls won't hold back oceans indefinitely if we keep heating the planet. The past whispers a paradox. Climate disruption is inevitable, but collapse isn't. The societies that endured, like the Egyptians who diversified their crops after Nile failures, or the Inuit who traded farming for hunting when Greenland froze, did so by embracing flexibility over dogma. Today, that might mean reviving ancient water harvesting techniques while investing in solar farms, or combining indigenous fire management with AI-driven early warning systems. The solutions won't come from clinging to a single vision of progress, but from stitching together every tool humanity has ever devised to weather the storm. As you reflect on these 29 turning points, consider which parallels unsettle you most. Is it the way Russian heatwaves toppled governments in 2010, mirroring how failed monsoons doomed the Tang Dynasty? Or how Australia's apocalyptic fires echoed the Anasazi's drought-driven exodus? The common thread isn't just suffering, it's the missed opportunities to act before disaster struck. We're standing at the same crossroads, armed with something our ancestors lacked, the chance to learn from their hindsight, so let these stories linger. Share them, not as doomscroll fodder, but as conversation starters. Debate whether modern cities are repeating the mistakes of Mesa Verde or forging new paths. Question which innovations will seem as short-sighted to future generations as the Dust Bowl's deep plowing does to us. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now, the climate is composing our stanza. The question is whether we'll write verses of resilience or recklessness. Hit subscribe if you're ready to keep unraveling history's tangled threads, and drop a comment below. Which climate event left you rethinking our future? The answers